Well, thank you. As you know, because many of you have come to other series of this webinar, the webinar, The Elephant at the Table, explores how power inequities prevent a real food systems transformation. Food systems are shaped by power, by who control resources, including land, water, and biodiversity, by who decides which agricultural model and which farmers to subsidize, by who decides which crops receive public funds and support. When power is ignored, efforts to transform food systems remain insufficient. This series draws on a one-year collaboration that I led while in residency in Hamburg, Germany. I was the program chair for this project on food and power at the New Institute. The collaboration involved 8 scholars and practitioners who developed concrete food policy recommendations to confront power across different sectors of the food systems, including agroecology, fisheries, seeds, affordable diets, governance, and more. The series covers 8 topics as listed on this slide. Today's session is on agroecology and power. And I want to tell you that when I worked with Maria in Hamburg, we were very excited to see how much global attention agroecology was getting. Something hard to imagine just a few years ago. But we kept coming back to the same concern. Agroecology is too often reduced to a set of better farming practices, almost like a checklist. And its promise is really much bigger than that. Agroecology can become truly transformative when it changes who has control and ownership over land and water, when it strengthens farmers' resources, when it connects production to local markets. Those ideas guided our work together, and I hope that it will guide today's conversation. This series is hosted by the New Institute, Food and Planet, the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab at the New School. And for today's session, we have as co-hosts ETH Zurich, CIRAT, and Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. Thanks to the events and communication staff, the IT staff, and Cedric Gottfried, PhD candidate in public policy, in public and urban policies at the New School, for their assistance with running the webinar series. And I'll introduce the speakers now. Today's main presenter is María Fernanda Mideros. She's the co-founder and director of the Centro ISA at Universidad de los Andes, working with peasant, family, ethnic, and indigenous organizations across 15 regions in Colombia. She works with FAO, UNDP, and Colombia's Ministry of Agriculture, bringing scientific evidence into food systems policy. Her work investigates agroecology not as a farming method, as I mentioned, but as a contest over territory, people, and power. And our panelists today, Johanna Jacobi, she's an assistant professor of agroecological transitions at ETH Zurich. Her research approaches agroecology as a transformative science, a practice, and a social movement. Isabel Bañerón, she's an economist at CIRAT. Her work in Laos, Madagascar, Colombia, and beyond brings important lessons on agroecological practice and its potential to transform food systems. Lisa Fuchs, she's a social and agroecological scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. She works on agroecological living landscapes, and she brings a critical view on how to approach co-creation. Ángela Penagos, she's an economist at the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. She has spent her career working at the intersection of rural development, territorial inequality, and public policy in Colombia. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A portion. As a reminder that the session videos will be recorded and posted at a later date. And now I'll hand it over to Maria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. So can you confirm if you can see my screen, please? So. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining to this webinar. Thank you also to Jose Luis, Christine, for the organization, and all to the team behind the science that made this possible. Thank you very much for this great panel of experts. It will be an interesting discussion about agroecology. So the title of the report we have been working on for the past year is unveiling the transformative potential of agroecology. And our objective today is to answer one question, the question that will guide the next minutes. How can we unlock the transformative potential of agroecology in the face of deep-rooted structural constraints? So, before we start, I would like to show you a short outline of the report and its section. We divide this report into 4 sections. The first part is related with the diagnosis. This is a review of the current status of agroecology. The second part was the structural barriers. So here we discuss maybe the mainly 6 power imbalances most directly related to agroecology. This is not all the options that we have to discuss agroecology, but we select only 6 that we consider that is important to discuss in this report. So the third part is the heart of our report, is a vision that we have with agroecology and with this analysis. And finally, we include pathways. Here we discuss maybe 17 actions across 3 different pillars that we need to do to transform the food system using agroecology. So that is the table that we are sitting today for this discussion. So let me start with something the data makes very clear. The food system is broken. Industrial agriculture is responsible for about 70% of biodiversity loss and between 25 or 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Every year, the planet loses around 7.6 million hectares of forest. And the report is very clear about why this is happening. Food system was designed to maximize corporate profits and not to feed people, not to regenerate ecosystems, not to sustain rural communities. This is not a system that can be fixed with a small change. And the reason is simple. It's breaking down. The challenge that are coming are too big for that kind of approach. We need fundamental changes. We need to build it again. On the other hand, agroecology offers something fundamentally different. And the chapter is very clear about what that means. First, ecological regeneration. The empirical evidence on soil fertility, water retention, ecosystem stability, and promoting agrobiodiversity is well established in agroecology. Second, food sovereignty for the communities that produce food is also well documented, along with the resilience that comes from diversified systems. And third, and I think that is what makes agroecology different from other sustainable approach, is the redistribution of power, the recognition of plural knowledge, and territorial approach of food economies. So this is not an exhaustive list of what makes agroecology different. This is, however, the core issue of this webinar at the points that we want to explore. So this transformative potential maybe is based on an initial hypothesis. Our hypothesis is simple: agroecology can transform our food system, but only if we confront the power imbalances that shape access to land, to knowledge, capital, and decision making. So let me name the elephant in the room. To do that, I want to start with one sentence I keep coming back to. We talk a lot about what farmers should do, but we talk much less about what the system does to them. So the elephant in the room is power, power over land, over water, over the rules, over what counts as valid knowledge, and power over who get access to markets on who doesn't. This is what I mean. Agroecology doesn't have a technical problem. So the idea in this report is agroecology has a power problem. So for this, this report points six structural barriers. And what matters here is that they are not just a technical, as I mentioned before. There are political, there are structural barriers. I'll go through them quickly. This is not the complete picture. So maybe you can find another structural barriers that are not discussed in this report, but we think that it gives give us a good snapshot of the main issues. The first one is related with insecure labor. The question here is who fits the world. Usually women, usually small farmers, usually in an informal way, but subsidies still flow to industrial agriculture, not to them. Small farmers carry the food system on precarious work. Second, and that is closely related, is land concentration. 1% of farms control 70% of farmland. This is a really important thing because it's one of the most interesting structural barriers that we are discussing in this report. We all know about this problem. To give only one example, about 20% of those deals were linked to green initiatives, for example, carbon markets, biofuels, conservation projects, and this is very common known as land grabbing. Water, that is the third barrier that we analyze in this report. So the question is who controls the water, and it's a real situation that is not farmers who control it, is industry. They take it, they contaminate it, and they decide who can access to water. Then comes governance. Governance is another point because food policy is shaped by agribusiness lobbies. And when communities are invited to participate, for example, it often just means a meeting, but it's not a real transfer of power or a real making decision process. Fit is knowledge, and with this barrier, we had a lot of discussion about the implication of this knowledge. So, for example, with the seed patents, they create monopolies, and smallholders farmers are the ones that maintain left unable to pay the price. Another example is the digitalization of agriculture. It is sometimes branded as a climate smart or sometimes are precision agriculture, but what it does is centralize the control. And finally, indigenous and peasant knowledge sometimes is called local, but when you talk about local knowledge, too often becomes another way to saying it does not really count. Finally, we had a lot of discussions about markets. Smallholder farmers often lack access to agroecological markets. They lack fair finance, they lack certification system designed for them. And then we ask, them to complete the equal terms. So this is a briefly summary that we discussed. But now there is maybe something else I need to mention. As agroecological became more visible in global policy spaces, it becomes more vulnerable to cooptation. Powerful institutions adopting the language of agroecology. For example, with climate smart, regenerative, on nature-based solutions, precision agriculture, but they did not adopt its politics. They keep the words and drop the question of power. This reformist framework can improve some practices, but they work within industrial agriculture. They don't challenge who owns the land, they don't challenge who owns the seeds, and they don't transfer power to communities. One example that is very interesting in this part maybe could be the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, but countries wrote food sovereignty in their constitutions, and that sounds transformative, right? But what happened in practice? In practice, the state have the discourse and sounds really transformative, but real power did not reach the communities. This is the key point. Cooptation is not an accident, it's a strategy, and this is the point that we discuss on the report. It's also a barrier, and when we confuse visibility with transformation, agroecology becomes just another brand, and still operating inside the same extractive system. And this is a real problem. So what is the alternative? We call this, or the vision that we propose is called reclaiming power. And this is why technical fixes are not enough. What is needed is a fundamental shift in power relation for a real transformation. For this, we propose three big pillars to discuss this proposal. The first pillar is about land, is about water, finance, and work. Right now, we treat them as a commodities that we can buy or we can sell, but we need to treat them as a commons. We need to think that we need to share resources, and we need that communities need to be more involved in these discussions to govern together. The second pillar is focuses in knowledge and food economies. Here we open knowledge to different stakeholders. We recognize that farmers' knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and ancestral knowledge is really important and could be the central for the discussion on agroecology. Finally, the third pillar is governance. We need to reshape how decisions are made. We move toward territorial participation or participatory decision-making across all levels. And we need to make this change to advance in a real agroecological transformation. So additional to this, we include maybe 17 recommendations. We organize this recommendation around these three pillars to try to organize a pathway. So the idea here is not explain each one. So maybe this is an invitation to read the report, but we would like to mention that there is not a checklist. Yeah, maybe it's a coordinate effort that we need to do to try to transformate or to have an emancipatory transformation using agroecology. So also we discuss about the evidence sometimes work in one place, but sometimes this is not scalable. And agroecology has this problem because sometimes it's more related with the context or local context, but it's difficult to scale to another level. This report is honest in this topic about what is required to move from isolated practices to systemic transformation. So for this, we discuss maybe four conditions that we have to present, and all these conditions need to work together. The first one is policy coherence. Agroecology cannot succeed if agriculture policy is in another way. So we need to connect different policies. We need to have a coherence to maintain this pathway around agroecology. This involve health, education, nutrition, food policies, and we need to coordinate all this information. So the second one is maybe the long-term public financing. So the main, or maybe in many countries, the problem is that we don't have funds to support this agroecological transition. When one small farmer wants to move toward agroecological idea, so need an investment. So multi-year national budgets are not enough. So we need a big projects. We don't need a pilot projects because this is very dynamic, and sometimes they're not offer a real solution. The third point is legal recognition of community rights. And I think that this is one of the most important things that we discussed during the report, because we need to work together in these making decision processes. It's not just a consultation, it's to involve the communities on the decision. And sometimes in the paperwork, it's easy to put these initiatives, but sometimes in the reality of the communities, there is difficult to be involved in these processes. And fourth is the recognition of social movements as a political actors. So not consulted from the outside. We need to sit at the table with different stakeholders, and we need to construct together to make this possible. So when these four conditions are missing, you get isolated initiatives. But when they are present and work together, so maybe you get systemic transformation. So this is the vision that we want to discuss today. So maybe these are only two small conclusions that I would like to share with you. The pillars cannot stand in silos. They need to connect, and they need to work together. And if we work in power, so maybe we can see the transformative and emancipatory potential of agroecology. So thank you very much. And for me, it's a pleasure to have this discussion with these great experts on this topic. So thank you very much, Jose Luis.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's very useful for us to understand how you are addressing many of the elephants at the table when we talk about our ecology, like control and ownership over land or over water, knowledge, what counts as valid knowledge, and focusing also on local markets, not only export and urban elite markets. Like that has been one of the approaches. So now we'll hear comments from our experts. Each will share brief 5-6 minute reflections connecting today's presentation to their own work. And as a reminder, please submit any questions into the Q&A I'll hand it over to Johanna right now. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will reflect a bit on the question whether agroecology can be understood as a truly transformative pathway capable of addressing or even dismantling existing power structures and inequalities in the food system. And I would say somehow yes and no, because yes, of course, with the new wars, with the current energy fertilizer crisis and so on, we can see yes, it's first absolutely necessary to circumvent these power structures to be able to continue. And how agroecology can do that, we see it all the time, like not using fertilizers, trying to get rid of fossil fuel dependency and so on. So we see really how it is not just possible, but also absolutely necessary to support agroecology transition to have domestic or local food provision, right? So we can see, yes, that is actually possible pathway, so to say, out of the poly crisis. So I think that's very powerful. But then besides this circumventing power, agroecology is also where we can see that niches often influence the mainstream in a positive way. So, for example, let's say in Germany, it was like until 2 weeks ago, it was like absolutely impossible to discuss sugar tax until one conservative politician started to talk about it, and now it seems it's coming. So sometimes there's some influence of these food system debates that then influence also the mainstream. But I think at the same time, and this is why I also say no, is we see a massive, massive pushback, because as soon as agroecology gets transformative, there is, of course, it's touching interests and there's pushback. For example, now in Switzerland, Parliament is discussing of taking away the subsidies from small farmers. So you have to have a certain size to be able to get subsidies. And many agroecology initiatives are actually very small, right? So it would be a disaster, and it's part of the pushback, I would say. And that shows us also that agroecology alone is not going to transform everything. It is really a bigger thing, and we have to discuss. I mean, Eat Peace Food has shown us in many times that we have to discuss broader topics than just agriculture and even just food consumption. They have shown the lock-ins, or some of the lock-ins, like the export orientation, the path dependencies, the silo thinking. So pointing to less isolationism, but more cooperative partnerships. But I think it's also this think bigger question. So we have to talk about labor, bullshit jobs, and how to have better jobs and meaningful jobs and so on. We have to talk about housing and rents, about transport, education. They're all connected, right? And they point towards a well-being transformation that our society needs to subscribe to in order to also agroecology to be able to be transformative. So that means there's no agroecology transition without these systemic questions. I mean, this is, I think, all clear to all of us. But what I think, like from a scientific, conceptual, methodological perspective, is very interesting is that we have to make it visible. So in the sense of you get what you measure, we have to develop and apply methods that are actually able to show this and also to show pathways of transformation. And I think we can draw on polycentric governance a lot. So I use in my research, for example, a power analysis from polycentric governance that divides first the power into the narrative power, and then also the legal power and the pragmatic power. So you see the different forms of power. Then you can also use the power cube that comes from John Gaventa, which I think is also really useful because it shows you on a three-dimensional cube, like where you are with your system, like is it a closed space or a claimed space or an invited space? And you can really also have these different dimensions of power and see where you are in the cube and what is needed to move it to more open spaces and from invisible to visible power and so on. So I think there are good methods that we can use, but I think they're not nearly used enough to make the power visible. If we use them, we can find very interesting things. For example, we analyzed in Brazil why organic soybean is not really transforming the soybean sector as much as it was supposed to do. We just published an article that's called Power Relation and Challenges for Organic Soy and Sustainability Transitions in Paraná, Brazil, where we used the multi-level perspective to see if and how these niches influence the mainstream. We found that the lock-ins are just so strong that they align more to the mainstream than they transform it, because first, the organic farmers, they have to bear all the burden of showing what they're doing better, but also if they're like contaminated, then they also have the disadvantage from that. And there's really also a mechanism that protects them in any way. And then the narrative and framing power is really really, really prevalent that like even little kids get already as gifts, they get like little toys that are pesticide sprayers, basically, or these agricultural machines that promote this agribusiness view of soybean. So we see it's like very entrenched in this mainstream system and then very hard to think about of anything different. So some the researchers say it's all about the imagination, and if we can't even imagine a different way of doing, how will it ever transform? So all these are forms of power that we need to investigate, make visible, and then of course address. And where it really becomes interesting for me was when it links to post-growth and decolonial debates. For example, there's this wonderful paper by McGreevy that talks about post-growth food systems and shows also these shifts in principles. I think it was also mentioned now in the report how to move from commodity food to commons. So there are wonderful ideas and concepts around. But where it becomes then really also more transformative is when we look at the worldview, like how we understand the world and the relationships to our food and to each other. Where I like to use Arturo Escobar's literature a lot, that says actually the polycrisis we experiencing is a crisis of a particular worldview, right? And this is where then we have the chance to also take into account other ways of doing things and other worldviews. Like there are alternatives to capitalism. There are alternatives to how the food system is configured right now, to the corporate food regime. And if we then challenge this one worldview that Escobar describes, then we can also maybe at some point get a more relational view to the food system and overcome this anthropocentric divide that I think is really at the center of the problems that we're facing, right? And maybe I can close with this quote from Escobar that says, our modes of thinking must be radically transformed to become radically transformative. So it's really, for me, also very much a worldview crisis that has to do with this power confrontation that we are looking for. Maybe so far at the moment.
Thank you so much, Johanna. We'll pass it over to Isabel, and it was very interesting to understand your perspective on these pathways for transformation and polycentric governance also that you mentioned. Over to you, Isabel.
Okay, thank you very much. So to address this question, I think that maybe I'll focus on just a few points of how agroecology can be transformative. For me, I think one of the important topics is to be able to be transformational. You need to convince people outside of your group. And I think that so agroecology needs to be an agroecological movement, and people who are involved in this these initiatives and way of worldview, as Joanna was saying previously, need to be able to engage in discussion with other type of actors, such as consumers, such as policymakers, such as companies, agribusiness, etc. And maybe one of the main ideas is that we need to have a more democratic food system and change foods and reshape food system governance so that the power is redistributed and there's more possibilities of discussing and between the different actors around the table. So that means strengthening cooperatives and collective collaborative action. That also means maybe focusing more at the territorial level where this can happen. And I think that in this perspective, maybe not looking at food systems as a whole, but looking at specific territories as places where changes can really happen. And I think that this is important because focusing at the territorial level is a place where you can have actors come together in an intersectoral way. You have cross-sectoral dialogues, people who can discuss together, where you can bring to the table producers, small companies, policymakers, communities, and where you can share a specific worldview and look at the agroecological transformations and specific pathways that are tailored to this specific territory. And the territory can be a place where the rules can be changed, where new markets can be found, where innovations can be thought about together. And this brings to another topic, which is the one of blending different types of knowledge. And I think this is very important. We have a project here in Colombia where we're trying to have territorial-based multi-stakeholder workshops where we bring together different type of actors and where we value different types of knowledge. And I think that part of reclaiming power goes with reclaiming power of which type of knowledge is mobilized. And it doesn't mean only having community knowledge or indigenous knowledge, but blending this knowledge with other types of knowledge. And finally, I think that one important way of making agroecology transformation is building these alternative markets that we're talking about. And this means being able to discuss more with consumers, for example, and being able to create these new markets, mindful markets. There was a movement in Southeast Asia, the early 1990s, that was talking about these mindful markets that were alternative types of markets. And then there's the issue of how you build these initiatives, because if you remain at the level of the territory, or if you remain at the level of the short supply chain or very small local alternative markets, how do you scale these initiatives without losing your soul, which is yet another issue. We saw this. I've been working a lot on fair trade markets, and there have been a lot of debates, a lot of conflicts on how fair trade can become a bigger market without losing its soul through the mainstreaming. So we also have this conflict of values that we have been mentioning before. So yeah, I would see it as transformational pathways, these type of maybe questions of blending different types of knowledge, building alternative markets, and reshaping governance, and with a focus on territorial level, but not keeping at the territorial level, but also finding ways of connecting initiatives, territories, to find a way of scaling up, but without losing the core values of the movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Very interesting comments. Particularly, I'll take your first one of persuading, convincing other people outside of this group of people that are more convinced about our ecology. We need to engage more stakeholders, more actors. I know that the word stakeholders is a little bit controversial, but yes, other people that are involved in promoting or have the potential to promote our ecology. I'll hand it over to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So first of all, I really enjoyed the report, and I really enjoyed the specific section of the report. I think it's really interesting. And I also really enjoyed the fact that we got some of the background and the history, if you will, of the status quo. Sometimes we tend to forget that. And I found it very interesting that the report discusses the history of separation, man versus nature, man prioritized over nature, culture versus nature, where dominant culture is associated also with class, of course, as we know, and with consumption prioritized over subsistence use, etc. And then also the combination of that with the history of individualization, private land holdings, private resource use, private decision-making on farming practices, etc. And in combination with that, also this differentiation of different user groups rather than identity groups, if you will, defined more by their users and by their needs than by their assets and their strengths and their collective wisdom, if you will. So I found that very interesting. I also find very interesting the propositions of the chapter. So I think there's two things that are really important, and of course we've seen them, that first of all, food systems should deliver food sovereignty to feed all, ecosystem regeneration, and social justice, and to provide decent livelihoods. And the strategies proposed are three: equitable access to resources, finance, and decent labor, democratizing knowledge systems, and solidarity-based markets and participatory governance. So I find all of that very interesting. And it made me think about how we conceptualize agroecology and how our conceptualization of agroecology somewhat leads to how we identify strategies, right? And as we know, agroecology has many different concepts and definitions, and different authors identify different core aspects. So us at the Alliance, or at the CG more broadly, we typically use the 13 agroecological principles of the CFS high-level panel of experts from 2019. And the authors themselves, as many of us know, differentiate in different ways. So there's principle 1 and 2 that are grouped, and then 3 to 7, and then 8 to 13. But overall, in terms of looking at the transformative potential, typically the authors differentiate principles 1 to 7 that they say focus on the agroecosystem and focus more on incremental change, whereas principles 8 to 13 focus on the food system and deal with matters of transformative change. So this is what the authors did. And of course, many different authors and many different people who work in the agroecology space have different ways of looking at what the core domains are of agroecology. So me personally, in my work, I have for a long time differentiated between like 3 different nested sets of principles, if you will, 1 to 5 ecological farming and land use. That includes production, but also restoration and conservation. And then 6 and 7, so synergies and economic diversification, in combination with 10 and 11, fairness and connectivity, focusing really on economic circularity. So as the second core aspect. And then the third core aspect, principles 8 and 9, so co-creation of knowledge and social values and diets, with 12 and 13 on governance and participation that then contribute to social justice. So I've long seen the 3 core domains of agroecology along that triple understanding. So for me, it's like in these different aspects, like these 3 aspects that together bring about fairer food systems that can feed everybody and that can produce healthy food for everybody without trashing the planet, as my former supervisor used to say. So in terms of the transformative potential, what really matters is the idea that co-creation is at the center. And as previous speakers have said as well, like really this importance of bringing together different knowledge sources, ways of knowing, and really understanding that is not just a quick and easy fix of including somebody, but that it's in reality a complex and deep thing. And here, the co-creation of knowledge principle invites also the concept of transdisciplinarity, right, on transdisciplinary approaches. Here again, transdisciplinary approaches, there are different definitions for what that means. But typically, again, also we're using the HLP definition of these approaches being real-world problem-focused, solution-oriented, inclusive, and reflexive. So what that means then is that it really invites for a continuous process of thinking and testing and evaluating and adjusting across all domains of the food systems. And that really then mobilizes all these diverse knowledge types and systems at all stages as well, and requires critical reflection and self-reflection. So far, so good. Many people agree with this, I think. But then one of the things that we notice is that often people struggle to understand how to do that. And I think that is perhaps also why I was invited. So at the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIET and the CG more broadly, we do a lot of applied research. And in the context of the work that we have been doing, in the CGR Agroecology Initiative and now in the science program on multifunctional landscapes, we have developed a whole set of structured principle on value-based engagement processes and approaches that can then help to systemically operationalize like these ideas. And the first one that I would like to briefly introduce is the concept of the living landscape. So living landscapes as the conceptual Überbau or superstructure that embeds then all these transformative approaches, if you will, or all these different transdisciplinary approaches that can be taken, which is, of course, an adaptation of the living lab concept that is becoming very popular as well, especially in the context of agroecology debates, but is more inclusive, focuses on broader landscape challenges and also on more actors. The second thing I would like to mention is that we developed this structured multi-stakeholder engagement approach that we call landscape vision to action. That, of course, builds on a long tradition of participatory action research methods and approaches, but where we use a backcasting method to support stakeholders to develop transition pathways for how they can jointly achieve a vision, where the idea then is that different stakeholders discuss and understand where their contribution to the broader transition is and how their contribution interacts with contributions from other people. So a de-isolating approach, if you will. And on top of that, like beyond the purpose for stakeholders themselves, the idea that then also external support can provide responsive support in line with these. The last 3 points I wanted to mention briefly is, of course, there's also a lot of structured methods for on-farm innovation co-design. Of course, ecological land use continues to be important, mobilizing diverse knowledge types, using local seed, local materials, defining challenges and practices together, monitoring criteria, have exchange visits and regular iterations to then gradually adapt and improve the diverse on-farm practices. Then also, as previous speakers have mentioned, this importance of operationalizing the economic circularity. So really understanding or supporting that there's production in line with local tastes and diets, so that there's access to healthy food choices. Here again, we work a lot on this aggregation potential of participatory guarantee system groups, both for production, local production, strengthening of local food systems, but also to strengthen the capacity for processing, which we all know is important also for retaining and improving circularity of value at local systems. And then also we work quite a bit also on this idea of economic diversification, so differentiating different products and prices and markets so that producers and PGS groups themselves can internally subsidize so that they can provide healthy food alternatives at the local market and potentially cross-subsidize that through more expensive ones in prime markets. And then another last point here is that we're also really looking at incentive structures. So the idea also that also in incentive structures, this fragmentation and the isolation of different actors needs to be overcome. And very often when we look at local food system transformation, we're looking at many different actors needing to make changes simultaneously. And how can we understand them as an institutional ecosystem and really provide institutional ecosystem incentives? So all of this to say that the important part of what we're trying to achieve, I think, and where we really need methods is to re-establish connections between nature and production, of course, but also connections between people, relationships, exchanges, and not only between individual people, but between networks. Because when we are able to leverage different networks and have these integrated loops and network effects, then we can really achieve changes at scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. A lot to process there. Thank you for mentioning also the high-level panel of experts report on our principles and our ecology, because we built on that to provide an additional value on confronting power together with Maria. And I'll hand it over to Angela, our last panelist today.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Maria Fernanda. Hi, Jose Luis. Okay, I am the last one, so probably I will reinforce some ideas that my colleagues have mentioned. First of all, probably my first message is that agroecology becomes genuinely transformative, in my view, when it moves beyond being understood simply as a set of agricultural practices and become part of a broader political, economic, and territorial strategy capable of reshaping food systems, as the paper is saying. Too often, agroecology is discussed mainly from a technical perspective, as a way to reduce chemical inputs, strengthen biodiversity, improve soil health, or increase resilience to climate change. And all of that is important. Agroecological principles can certainly contribute to healthy relationships between ecosystems, communities, and food production systems. But the real transformative potential of agroecology lies in the capacity to reshape the very logic through which agricultural production systems are organized and valued. Agroecology reminds us that food production ultimately depends on ecological foundations that sustain life itself: soil fertility, water regulation, pollination, biodiversity, climate stability, and the regenerative capacities of ecosystems. In that sense, its contribution goes far beyond local production practices or territorial governance. Its transformative potential emerges when societies begin to recognize that preserving natural capital and the ecosystem services that sustain life is not an environmental luxury or issue, but a precondition for maintaining long-term capacity to produce food, sustain economies, and guarantee social stability. This implies a profound shift in development models and decision-making processes. Once environmental and social costs associated with ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, and climate vulnerability are fully incorporated into economic systems, the logic of production, investment, trade, and value chain necessarily change. Agroecology, therefore, has not has the potential to transform not only farming practices, but also the economic incentives, power relations, and institutional frameworks that shape global food systems. But to advance in that way, I believe the current debate we still lacks on a stronger connection between agroecology and the broader development model. We should consider development-related concerns such as prices, incomes, distribution, labor, productivity, and poverty. These are important topics that must be connected to the traditional approach to agroecology because food systems are not only about how food is produced, they are also about who has the access to food, who controls the market, who captures the value along supply chains, and ultimately who benefits from the system. And this is where I believe agroecology still face an unresolved tension. Much of the discussion remains heavily focused on the supply side, sustainable production, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem restoration, and climate resilience. These dimensions are fundamental, but they are not sufficient. A truly transformative approach must also confront one of the central contradictions of today's food systems. The world already produces enough food, yet millions of people still cannot access to healthy diet because the problem is not only production, it is inequality, poverty, exclusion, weak purchasing power, and unequal access to market and opportunities. And we also cannot ignore that many of the historical reductions in hunger and extreme poverty were associated with the increase in agricultural productivity. And this is linked to prices, lower foods, and greater food ability. Those achievement matters. So the challenge today is not choosing between productivity and sustainability. The real challenge is reconciling ecological sustainability with the capacity to ensure affordable, accessible, and nutritious food for growing population amid climate change and deep inequality. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Very interesting. And also, I'll stick to one of your first comments about, yeah, agroecology should be a broader or should have a broader political perspective to make it transformative. But thank you, Maria, Johanna, Isabel, Lisa, Angela, for this thoughtful overview of the nuances of how to make agroecology a real transformative force for food systems. So now we'll have a couple of minutes only to address one of the questions. So I'll ask Johanna or Maria maybe to address this question. Groups like La Vía Campesina and IPES Food are also confronted the cooptation of agroecology within international food systems governance. What do you think needs to happen from a strategic policy making aspect to strengthen this and other efforts addressing the cooptation of agroecology and also the cooptation of food sovereignty in policy that we have discussed today? So just we have like a couple of minutes only for answers. So who wants to address this one? Sorry to put you on the spot, Johanna.
Maybe very shortly, from a policy perspective, I think it's very important to make sure that the social movements are always present. So it's a question of representation, so that they cannot be sidelined, and they will always fight cooptation, right? So this is one, and then as a scientist, I can always check again against the agroecological principles, and the two most important for me are always like, is it a project or an activity that fosters diversity? And is it participatory in a democratic sense? I mean, they are all important, but these two are like kind of for me the red lines where I see very quickly, okay, is it cooptation or not? And then of course the power question. I mean, yeah, there are many ways to do this, and it helps already if we are all aware and if we always check for this and always bring it to the front.
Thank you. Anybody else, Maria, or anybody else wants to address this one?
Yes, so maybe I would like to add to the comment from Johanna. So I think that one important discussion here is to try to stop treating agroecology as just a technical toolbox. So maybe agroecology is more than practices, is more than yields or climate smart solutions. It's to discuss from agroecology into the policy field as more a different perspective. And I think that this is one important discussion that we need to have. So maybe here in Colombia, I think that the first step for this discussion is to create a policy related with agroecology. And in this policy is not just for a toolbox or practices. It's more than this is related with food sovereignty, are all things that we discuss during this panel. So maybe this is my point for the questions.
Thank you, Maria. And Angela, in 30 seconds, a quick idea.
Just one idea. It is important to link agroecology with the development problems. It is not. It is important for the people, and not only for the rural people, for the urban people to understand agroecology like a way to reduce poverty, improve labor conditions, and to have the capacity to produce food for everybody. And I think that when we are only in one side of the discussion, as I said in my intervention, in the discussion of production, we are ignoring the development problems. And there is an option of cooptation, and probably not to make that like in a transformative way.
Thank you so much, Angela. Very good closing for this conversation. I think we need to link agroecology with many different areas around sustainable, inclusive development, for sure. And thank you to all the presenters for sharing such valuable insights, and to all of you for joining. As we mentioned, the Paris Policy Brief is available for deeper reading. The link is in the chat. Our next and last session, at least for this season, is on Wednesday, May 27th, and is titled Aquatic Food Systems and Power. Please scan the QR code on the slide or click on the link in the chat to sign up for the rest of the live webinar series for that last session. And if today showed us anything, is that the future of food belongs to all of us if we confront and we deal with the power asymmetries that prevent a real transformation. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you at the next session. Thank you.